I hope no one saw that. The words slipped out before I even realized I was speaking, my voice barely audible over the clatter of ceramic hitting marble. My heels had betrayed me on the lobby floor, and the vase that had been perched like a delicate ornament now lay in shards at my feet. I froze, hands hovering over the broken pieces, heart hammering as the echo of the crash bounced off the high ceilings. Then I felt it, a presence, sharp and commanding, slicing through the chaos like a knife. Marcus Romano appeared at the top of the staircase, perfectly poised in a tailored black suit, his dark hair slicked back, eyes a stormy gray that seemed to see every misstep I'd ever made. The lobby felt smaller, the air thicker, as he descended, each step measured, deliberate, radiating a calm control that contradicted the frenzy around us. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how my hair clung to my damp forehead, how my palms were slick against the thin gloves I'd hastily pulled on this morning. "You should be more careful," he said, voice low, measured, almost conversational, yet laced with an unspoken command. My cheeks burned, both from embarrassment and the inexplicable weight of his gaze. I opened my mouth, wanted to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck somewhere between thought and breath. He stopped a mere foot from me, the scent of his cologne sharp and lingering, a hint of cedar and something darker, something undeniably potent. The lobby around us blurred, people moving, talking, existing in a world I could no longer perceive. Marcus's eyes flicked to the broken vase, then back to me, the briefest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This is why no one lasts here a week," he continued, almost to himself, almost teasing, yet with a weight that made my knees feel weak. I wanted to step back, wanted to make a dash for the elevator, but the polished marble beneath my feet held me in place. My chest rose and fell too quickly, the adrenaline hammering through my veins as I realized every instinct screamed to flee, yet every sense told me I couldn't. He reached out, not roughly, not threatening, but with a precision that seemed to study my balance, my posture, the subtle tremor in my hands. "You're not like the others," he said, and I flinched, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. The world seemed to tilt slightly as he extended a hand, steady and sure, and before I could comprehend, he guided me upright, adjusting my stance, the movement intimate in its care, yet professional in its execution. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and curiosity, an unfamiliar warmth spreading despite my attempts to focus on the shards at my feet. The lobby, the shattered vase, even the hum of the city outside faded as Marcus's gaze anchored me, a tether I couldn't break. "Stay," he commanded softly, and I obeyed, my body taut, senses sharpened, aware of every breath, every flicker of light off the marble, the echo of distant footsteps, the subtle sway of the chandelier overhead. I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to, caught in a web of authority and unexpected care. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding in the background, and I thought I might run, but something held me fast. His hand brushed briefly against mine, a fleeting contact, yet enough to send a jolt through me, awareness heightened, heart racing. "You're not just anyone," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of promise and caution all at once. I nodded, uncertain, breath shallow, mind spinning as I took in the sharp lines of his face, the unyielding posture, the quiet dominance that seemed to bend the world around him. And in that moment, despite the embarrassment, the broken vase, the wet sheen on my shoes, I felt it. A connection, inexplicable, immediate, undeniable. Something had shifted. Something had begun. My hands were still trembling when Marcus guided me toward the grand double doors at the end of the lobby, the polished marble floor reflecting our figures like water caught in motion. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee from the small cafe, tucked into the corner, a normality I could not reconcile with the intensity radiating from him. Each step we took echoed softly, a measured rhythm that somehow contrasted with the rapid beating of my heart. He did not speak, yet his presence communicated volumes, a silent authority that filled the space between us. I could not help but notice the meticulous way he adjusted his cufflinks, the crisp crease of his pants, the subtle scent of cedar and citrus hanging in the air. My thoughts scattered, the sound of a distant elevator dinging making me flinch, but Marcus remained steady, unflustered, eyes scanning the surroundings as if calculating every possible outcome. The lobby staff avoided our path, their movements deliberate, acknowledging the unspoken dominance he carried. I wanted to look away, to regain some sense of composure, but his gaze held me captive, not threatening, not invasive, but undeniably commanding. As we approached the reception desk, he paused slightly, a hand brushing against the counter, fingertips grazing the edge lightly, as if testing the weight of the world in that moment. I took a tentative breath, aware of the cool air conditioning brushing against my damp skin, the smell of rain lingering faintly on my hair. He finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying the certainty of a man accustomed to control without raising it to a shout. "Stay close," he instructed softly, and I obeyed, each word anchoring me to the moment, to him, to this new reality I had inadvertently stepped into. The receptionist glanced up, polite curiosity in her eyes, but Marcus's presence seemed to command a subtle stillness, a quiet acknowledgement that some matters were above everyday concerns. My shoes clicked against the marble as we moved, each step a contrast between my nervous energy and his deliberate, unshakable pace. I felt exposed, vulnerable in my own clumsiness, yet there was an odd reassurance in the steady certainty of his movements beside me. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet my feet followed, almost automatically, as if the momentum of this encounter had set a course I could not resist. As we neared a small seating area, Marcus gestured toward a chair with a precision that made it impossible to misinterpret. I sank into it cautiously, adjusting my posture, hands resting lightly on my lap, aware of every subtle shift in his expression as he observed me. He remained standing, a silent pillar of composure, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my reactions, reading every flicker of doubt, every micro-expression. I felt my pulse quicken, awareness heightened, as the lobby seemed to fade around us, leaving only the interplay of tension and cautious curiosity. A faint smile brushed his lips, almost imperceptible, yet it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the chaos my presence had introduced into his controlled environment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking a suspended moment where time seemed both elongated and condensed, and I realized that nothing in this building, in this encounter, would be ordinary ever again. Marcus finally inclined his head slightly, a subtle invitation or perhaps a challenge, and I met his gaze, heart pounding, every sense alert, aware that the trajectory of my day, and perhaps my life, had shifted irreversibly in these brief minutes of shared space. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the space as Marcus gestured toward a small corridor leading off the lobby, his movements precise, deliberate, almost choreographed. I followed hesitantly, the sound of my heels clicking against the marble echoing lightly, mingling with the distant murmur of voices from the street outside. The corridor narrowed, walls lined with polished wood panels and framed artwork that seemed to tell stories of an old, refined elegance. Yet the presence of Marcus made the surroundings feel charged, each detail intensified under his gaze. He stopped before a large glass door, the sunlight streaming through casting sharp patterns across the floor. He placed a hand lightly on the handle, glancing back at me with a subtle nod, a silent invitation that carried both caution and expectation. My stomach twisted, the blend of anxiety and curiosity almost tangible, as I stepped forward, following his lead into a space that smelled faintly of leather and fresh parchment. The room was spacious, filled with shelves of neatly organized files, an antique desk that gleamed under the sunlight, and a series of tall windows that overlooked the city streets below. Marcus moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had orchestrated every element of this space to reflect control and order, and I felt the pull of that authority in every step he took. He finally turned to face me fully, the sharp lines of his jaw softened slightly by the light, his eyes locking with mine in a steady, unyielding stare that seemed to weigh my every thought. "Sit," he said, voice calm but carrying an unspoken weight, and I complied, sliding into a chair with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, aware of the subtle rise and fall of my own breath. Marcus circled the desk with a measured pace, fingers brushing against the polished surface, eyes scanning the room as though cataloging every detail before returning to me. "You are not like anyone else I have encountered," he said, and I swallowed hard, unsure if the observation was meant as a compliment or a caution. I could feel the tension in the air, a quiet energy that demanded attention, yet beneath it was an odd sense of care, a precision in his movements that conveyed attentiveness rather than threat. I adjusted my posture, hands still clenched lightly, trying to focus on anything besides the intensity of his gaze, but it was impossible. The room, the light, the quiet hum of the air around us all revolved around him, drawing my awareness inexorably toward his presence. A small clock on the wall ticked methodically, each second a reminder of the suspended moment I was trapped in, yet I could not bring myself to look away. Marcus's eyes softened just enough for me to notice, a fleeting glimpse that suggested patience, an expectation that I would find my footing in this unfamiliar dynamic. I felt a subtle shift, an unspoken understanding threading through the space between us, an acknowledgement of the unpredictability I had brought into his orderly world and the careful consideration with which he received it. He stepped closer, the faintest scent of his cologne brushing past me, and placed a hand lightly on the back of the chair, a grounding presence that contrasted the rapid flutter of my own pulse. "Focus," he said simply, voice low, precise, and I did, every sense heightened, attuned to his every movement, every subtle expression, feeling the gravity of the encounter settle around me like an invisible weight. The city below continued its hum, oblivious to the shift that had occurred within this quiet room, and I realized with a startled clarity that the ordinary world I had known was already slipping away, replaced by a tension, a curiosity, and a connection that neither of us had yet named, but both undeniably felt. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden beams across the polished floor, highlighting the intricate patterns in the marble and the careful arrangement of furniture that spoke of deliberate order and refinement. I shifted slightly in my seat, hands still folded neatly in my lap, aware of every small sound. The faint creak of leather from Marcus's shoes as he moved, the subtle rustle of papers on the antique desk, the distant hum of traffic far below, each detail amplifying the charged stillness of the room. Marcus stepped to the side, leaning briefly against the edge of the desk, fingers brushing lightly across the smooth surface as his eyes remained fixed on me, observing, measuring, deciphering. I felt exposed, yet strangely grounded under the steady weight of his gaze, each subtle expression conveying more than words ever could. "You did not expect this environment," he stated, voice calm, precise, yet carrying an undeniable weight of certainty. "Yet here you are." I nodded, swallowing hard, aware of how my chest rose and fell in rhythm with the tension that seemed to pulse between us. The sunlight caught his profile, highlighting the sharpness of his features, the subtle shadows that gave his expression an intensity that was almost tangible. I could not bring myself to look away, drawn inexplicably toward the poised control in his every movement, the careful consideration that seemed to radiate from him. A soft click of the desk drawer opening drew my attention, and Marcus produced a small leather-bound notebook, setting it down with deliberate care, the faint scent of new leather mingling with the existing warmth of the room. He gestured toward it with a nod, and I understood instinctively that this was an invitation, not to speak, but to observe, to take in the weight of the decisions and the structure that governed this world he inhabited. My eyes flicked over the pages, filled with neatly lined notes, schedules, and subtle annotations, and I felt the enormity of order, control, and meticulous planning that he maintained, a stark contrast to the chaos my earlier misstep had introduced. He moved back toward the windows, arms crossed, posture unwavering, yet a subtle ease in his stance hinted at an awareness of the human element before him, a recognition that my presence, clumsy and uncertain though it was, mattered in ways that transcended the surface of this calculated domain. I drew a shallow breath, the sunlight warming my skin, the hum of the city beyond faint yet constant, each sound and light blending into a rhythm that seemed both foreign and familiar under his watchful presence. Marcus's voice broke the quiet, soft but firm. "Every choice here matters, Emily. Even the smallest misstep carries significance." I felt the gravity of those words sink in, the weight of consequence, yet also an unspoken acknowledgement of potential, a silent promise that this space, this moment, was a beginning rather than an end. I straightened slightly, hands still folded, awareness heightened, pulse steadying as I realized that every detail, every movement, every deliberate breath of Marcus Romano carried meaning, and that in observing, in participating even quietly, I was stepping into a world both ordered and unpredictable, a world that had already begun to shift subtly around me, drawing me into a rhythm I had not anticipated but could not resist. The sunlight continued to streak across the room, illuminating both the space and the tension, and I felt, with a quiet certainty, that nothing in the ordinary life I had known could ever intersect with this again, that the encounter, the control, the careful precision of Marcus's presence had set a course I could not yet define, but one I would follow willingly, cautiously, completely. The sunlight shifted subtly as Marcus led me toward the set of tall windows that looked out over the city, casting long streaks of light across the room and illuminating every polished surface with a warm glow. I felt the weight of the moment pressing gently against my shoulders, the anticipation in the air almost tangible, a silent rhythm we were both attuned to. He moved with deliberate precision, hands brushing lightly over the back of a leather chair, fingertips grazing the smooth surface, and I could not help but notice the attention to detail, the meticulous care in every movement that suggested control and command without force. I shifted slightly, adjusting my posture, aware of how my own hands felt clammy despite the controlled breaths I was taking, the pulse in my neck quickening as I absorbed the tension and the subtle invitation of trust in his steady presence. Marcus's eyes scanned the room once more, sharp, calculating, then returned to meet mine, and I felt the unmistakable intensity of focus, a gaze that seemed to measure every thought, every small reaction, every flicker of hesitation. He gestured toward a small side table where a crystal decanter reflected the sunlight, droplets of light scattering like tiny stars across the polished floor, and I realized that even the simplest objects in the room seemed elevated by the presence of someone so commanding. I followed his gaze and then his subtle nod, moving closer to observe the way he balanced awareness with precision, noting how the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly as he spoke, voice calm and measured. Attention to detail shapes outcome. Observe, understand, anticipate. I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the awareness that every action, however small, carried weight here, and that my own instinctual reactions were part of an unspoken evaluation. I tilted my head, eyes tracing the angles of the room, the muted reflections in the glass, the subtle interplay of shadows and light, and I felt a curious combination of nervous energy and engagement, my senses heightened under his watchful observation. He stepped closer, the faintest sound of his shoes on the marble echoing softly, and placed a hand lightly on the edge of the table, a grounding gesture that contrasted the rapid rhythm of my thoughts, steadying yet commanding. Understand your surroundings, he continued. Voice low, precise, deliberate, each word a rhythm that aligned with the quiet pulse of the room. I nodded, focusing on each detail, the scent of polished wood and faint citrus in the air, the hum of the buildings settling around us, and felt the subtle tension between instruction and observation, between caution and exploration. My eyes returned to him as he moved slightly, the sun highlighting the sharp contours of his face, the calm authority in his posture, and I realized that every subtle gesture, every deliberate pause, carried significance, shaping a narrative I had not yet fully grasped but was already part of. The city beyond the windows continued its unceasing flow, unaware of the quiet exchange unfolding above its streets, and I understood, with an almost tangible clarity, that the trajectory of the day, of this encounter, was shifting, drawing me deeper into a rhythm of presence and awareness I could neither resist nor fully define, yet felt compelled to follow with careful attention and measured steps. Marcus moved toward the center of the room, gesturing subtly for me to follow, and I rose carefully, aware of the soft click of my heels against the polished marble. The sunlight had shifted slightly, painting long stripes of warmth across the floor and creating pockets of shadow that danced along the walls, highlighting the intricacy of the wood paneling and the meticulous order of the space. I trailed behind him, attentive to each measured step. Noticing the way he adjusted his posture slightly as he approached the large bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes, the faint scent of aged paper and polished wood blending with the lingering trace of his cologne. He selected a single book, running his fingers along the spine with deliberate care, and opened it to reveal a series of neat annotations, charts, and diagrams, the precision and clarity almost hypnotic in their orderliness. I stepped closer, my curiosity overcoming the residual nervousness, and leaned slightly forward, careful to maintain a respectful distance, absorbing every detail as Marcus spoke softly, his voice calm, yet carrying undeniable authority. Understanding context is essential. Every element contributes to outcome. Observe, analyze, anticipate. I nodded, aware of how quickly my pulse had risen, the rhythm of my breathing aligning with the cadence of his words, each one falling like measured notes in a composition I was learning to follow. The light caught his sharp features, casting faint shadows that accentuated the intensity of his gaze, and I felt simultaneously grounded and heightened, acutely aware of the subtleties in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw, the fleeting glance toward a small window that overlooked the bustling street far below. He closed the book gently, setting it on the desk with care, and turned toward me, eyes locking with mine in a moment that seemed suspended, each second stretching with quiet significance. I felt the air thicken slightly, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the building and the soft ticking of a clock, each tick amplifying my awareness of the space, of him, of the gravity of this unfolding connection. Marcus stepped closer, his movements fluid and precise, and gestured toward a chair near the window, a subtle invitation for me to sit and continue observing, learning, absorbing. I complied, settling carefully, hands resting lightly on my lap, noting the warmth of the sunlight on my skin, the faint cool draft from the slightly open window, and the way the room seemed to hold its breath, attuned to the quiet tension and the careful choreography of our interaction. He observed me closely, but not with judgment, rather with a deliberate attention that suggested consideration and expectation, a quiet guidance that pulled me into focus, aligning my perception with the order he maintained. Every subtle movement of his hand, the tilt of his head, the adjustment of his stance, carried a meaning I felt more than understood, creating a rhythm, a pulse that I could follow, a pattern of awareness, caution, and subtle engagement. I realized with a sudden clarity that this space, these moments, were shaping my perception, my senses, and my understanding of the intricate balance of control and responsiveness, and that Marcus's presence was not merely commanding, it was instructive, compelling, and quietly transformative. The sunlight continued to move, shifting angles across the floor, and I remained seated, alert, receptive, and aware, caught in the measured intensity of the room, the order he cultivated, and the subtle, unspoken lessons woven into each movement, glance, and instruction. The soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now, punctuating the quiet anticipation that hung between us like a tangible thread. Marcus gestured toward a narrow hallway leading to a smaller chamber adjoining the main office, his movements deliberate, controlled, a rhythm that I could feel in my chest as I followed hesitantly. The sunlight outside had shifted slightly, streaking through the windows at a new angle, casting long, golden lines that danced across the polished floor and illuminated the subtle grains in the wood paneling. I stepped carefully, heels clicking softly, aware of the echo that seemed to emphasize every breath I took, each pulse of energy that raced beneath my skin. Marcus paused just inside the doorway, hand brushing lightly against the frame, and I noticed how his posture conveyed both authority and a measured patience that seemed to anticipate my every hesitation. The room beyond was smaller, cozier, lined with shelves of neatly organized documents, each labeled meticulously, the faint scent of leather and fresh paper mingling with the subtle trace of his cologne that lingered in the air. He turned, eyes meeting mine with a steady, unyielding focus that drew my attention entirely, making it impossible to consider anything beyond the weight of his gaze. "Observe everything," he said softly, voice calm, deliberate, each word carrying an authority that resonated without need for volume. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away, acutely aware of the subtle movements in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw, the measured lift of an eyebrow, the way his hands shifted minutely, all suggesting thoughtfulness, calculation, and a quiet attentiveness to my reactions. I shifted slightly, adjusting my posture, hands resting lightly on my lap, conscious of the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the faint draft from the open window, and the rhythm of my own breathing matching the cadence of the room. Marcus moved toward a desk, fingers gliding along the polished surface, and opened a small leather-bound notebook, revealing neatly arranged notes, charts, and annotations that reflected a mind organized with precision and clarity. He gestured subtly for me to approach, and I did, leaning forward slightly, careful to remain within the space he allowed, absorbing the information, noting the careful balance between control and flexibility evident in the way the pages were maintained. His gaze never wavered, following my movements with a patience that was at once commanding and instructive, and I felt a mixture of trepidation and fascination, aware that every subtle gesture, every measured motion, was both an observation and a lesson. The quiet of the room, punctuated only by the distant hum of the building and the soft ticking of a wall clock, heightened my senses, drawing me fully into the moment, making each detail, light, sound, texture, and movement, resonate with significance. Marcus leaned slightly against the desk, eyes holding mine with an intensity that was at once grounding and inescapable, and I realized with a sudden clarity that this interaction, this careful choreography of presence and observation, had already shifted my awareness, drawing me into a rhythm of attentiveness and measured engagement that I could neither anticipate nor escape. Every subtle movement, every deliberate pause, every faint inflection in his voice seemed to layer meaning into the room itself, creating an environment where observation, understanding, and response were not optional, but essential, and I found myself wholly present, acutely aware of the interplay of authority, patience, and subtle instruction that defined Marcus Romano and the space he commanded. The late afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting long, soft shadows across the polished floors and warming the wood paneling with a golden hue. I sat in the chair, hands folded lightly in my lap, heart still racing from the intensity of the past hour, yet my mind strangely calm, focused on the rhythm of the room and the measured presence of Marcus. He moved slowly toward the window, one hand brushing the cool glass, the other resting lightly at his side, posture perfectly composed, yet carrying a quiet energy that filled the space. The city outside stretched in a sprawling grid, cars moving like distant currents, people unaware of the subtle shifts occurring within this quiet chamber above them. Marcus turned, eyes locking with mine once again, a steady, unyielding gaze that seemed to anchor me in the moment. Every subtle movement of his features, the faint shift of a brow, the soft parting of his lips, carrying significance I could not ignore. Decisions define environment, he said, voice low, deliberate, drawing me further into his rhythm, making the words feel heavier than their sound alone. I nodded, aware of the tension in my shoulders easing slightly, though my pulse remained quickened, alert to every motion, every subtle sound, every slant of sunlight that shifted across the floor. He stepped closer, and the faint scent of cedar and fresh leather brushed against me, grounding the intensity in a tangible, almost reassuring way. I felt the subtle pull of anticipation, a magnetic curiosity that made it impossible to look away, impossible to detach from the focused precision that defined his presence. A small clock ticked steadily in the background, each second marking a suspended moment where observation and awareness intertwined, and I realized that every nuance, every measured gesture, every subtle glance, was a thread weaving a larger pattern I had yet to fully comprehend. Marcus moved to the desk, fingers lightly tracing the edge of a polished document, and I noticed how every detail, every subtle adjustment, communicated thought, intention, and care, a rhythm of authority and attention that drew me into alignment with the space. I straightened, hands resting lightly, breathing measured, absorbing the quiet lessons in observation, patience, and attentiveness that seemed to ripple from him outward into the room. The sun shifted once more, illuminating a small detail on the desk I had not noticed before, and I realized that Marcus's approach was both subtle and deliberate, teaching through presence rather than instruction, through focus rather than words. I felt a curious blend of exhilaration and focus, aware that my awareness had been heightened, my senses attuned to every nuance of movement, light, sound, and intention in the room. Marcus turned slightly, the faintest incline of his head indicating expectation, and I met his gaze, pulse steadying, yet alive with the quiet thrill of anticipation, conscious that each moment, each subtle shift in expression, each carefully measured step, was shaping an experience I could neither fully predict nor resist. The room held its breath alongside me. Every detail, sunlight, polished surfaces, faint drafts, quiet hums, aligning with the subtle cadence of control and observation that Marcus maintained, and I understood, in a quiet, tangible way, that this was a space of learning, attention, and quiet connection, an intricate balance that demanded engagement, focus, and presence. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, amber streaks across the polished floor, and I remained seated, hands resting lightly on my lap, absorbing the subtle energy that Marcus radiated. He moved to the center of the room, each step deliberate, the soft click of his shoes on marble echoing in the quiet, blending with the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. I felt a mixture of anticipation and calm, my senses heightened, every small shift in light, every distant sound amplified by the charged atmosphere between us. Marcus stopped, his eyes locking with mine in a steady, unwavering gaze that held both scrutiny and a quiet invitation, an unspoken understanding that the next moment would define the rhythm of our interaction. He gestured toward the expansive view through the tall windows, the streets below teeming with life, unaware of the intensity unfolding above them, and I understood the silent lesson he imparted. Observation, awareness, and attentiveness could shape understanding in ways words could not convey. I leaned slightly forward, pulse steadying, absorbing the subtle movements in his expression, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the careful articulation in his eyes, each conveying precision, intention, and a measured openness. "Presence matters," he said softly, voice calm, resonant, carrying an unspoken weight that seemed to anchor the room itself, and I nodded, understanding the gravity in his words not through explanation but through the quiet authority he embodied. I shifted, becoming acutely aware of the rhythm of my own breath, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the faint draft through a slightly open window, all blending into the sensory pattern of observation and awareness that Marcus had cultivated. He circled the desk slowly, each movement intentional, tracing subtle lines in the air with his hand, as if conducting a quiet symphony of focus and attentiveness, and I followed, eyes absorbing, mind processing, senses attuned to every nuance. The room held a soft tension, a dynamic interplay between instruction and perception, and I realized that my own awareness was being reshaped, expanded, drawn into alignment with the meticulous care and quiet authority Marcus maintained. I felt the pull of curiosity, tempered with attentiveness, every subtle gesture a lesson in understanding and presence. Marcus paused near the window once more, hands resting lightly on the sill, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the interplay of light, shadow, and motion around us, and I understood that he was inviting me not just to observe, but to internalize, to become aware of the intricate balance of control, consideration, and attentiveness that defined his space. I inhaled slowly, the sunlight warming my face, the distant hum of the city a steady backdrop, and felt a quiet clarity. Each subtle shift, each deliberate gesture, each careful movement was a thread in a larger pattern, a rhythm of awareness and engagement that I was beginning to follow, present and attuned, fully immersed in the measured, precise, and quietly transformative space that Marcus had created around us.